Jordan, maybe you want to try to log off and then log back on?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Well, sorry for that glitch, but I think we are ready to start this, I think, which is the penultimate session of this two-day conference that focuses on social and emotional learning. First, let me thank the organizers for what has been a very interesting 2 days so far. And also on behalf of the organizers and myself to welcome and thank Professor Walsh and Dr. Naika to this session. Before I introduce the speakers and just give a brief intro to each of the presentations, I want to apologize on behalf of the third presenter, Dr. Dogra, who unfortunately is not able to join owing to some connection issues. This actually gives us a little more time for the two speakers, but I hope you can still be as concise as possible. So perhaps I think initially you were told you'll have about 18 minutes, so we can extend that a little to about 20 minutes or a little more. But it will give us more time for the discussion and Q&A session. As I think with most previous sessions, we will take each of the speakers' presentation in turn and hold off on any questions until both have completed their presentations. So let me, without much further delay, introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker, Dr. Naika, who's at the University of Western Cape, Professor Extraordinary, who was also previously a National Commissioner on the Committee for Education Support, appointed by the first president in the post-apartheid government, President Mandela, to investigate the state of special education. I'm not going to go further with the bio, as Dr. Naika has an extensive biography, both working within government, outside government, and in the academic sphere. So let me stop there, but just to say, Dr. Naika's paper looks at the social and cultural capital in working class communities, which often is a major obstacle in achieving academic success. In light of this, the paper introduces the notion of social and cultural capital as an impediment to progress, and argues that social and emotional learning in the foundation phase is critical for success. I would stop there as well and move on to introducing Professor Patrick Paul Walsh from Ireland, who is on secondment to the University College Dublin in International Development Studies and Director of the Centre for Sustainable Development at UCD Dublin. Also, Professor Walsh has an extensive CV, having held academic positions in Trinity College, at the University of Leuven, Harvard, and Columbia, and various positions in the UN system, in the European Commission, and the World Bank. His presentation will focus on a detailed analysis of gaps in achieving the SDG targets related to education across nations, focusing on the significant disparities within and between rich and poor nations. This is particularly important in the context of STEM, where the number of years to achieve progress varies substantially between rich and poor nations, as well as other issues related to environment and social education more generally. And according to Professor Walsh, there are the deficits across all fronts of the education outcomes that are expected. And Professor Walsh provides a conceptual framework that links investments in SDG education to lifelong learning and larger social returns. Again, let me stop there And without much ado, move on to the first presentation. Dr. Naika, over to you.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good evening from Cape Town, and I enjoyed. I think it's Professor Karori Singh's presentation around the colonial gaze, because I think that we have to ask some fundamental questions about colonization, and we have to ask some fundamental questions about how that has influenced the education narrative. Now, I looked at the education system in the developing world, and when I looked at the results of working class children in townships across South Africa and the developing world in general, and you have these international tests and so on, and I was really taken aback by the poor results in the system. I grew up in a working class township, so I enjoyed some social mobility, and I found that although I enjoyed social mobility, I think my working class consciousness was always present in my analysis. The performance of working class children, not only in the developing world, but in the developed world, is really, really problematic. And, so I've drawn a few conclusions, and then I'll get into the substance of the presentation. I think that education has been commodified, and education has been politicized. We know that schools reproduce the status quo. You have to look at the literacy and numeracy results. And some people argue that, well, some poor schools do well, but you can't really generalize from an exception. And unfortunately, the developing world looks at the developed world for answers, but the developed world in the UK and the US and other countries in the West have not actually sorted out the working class problem. So if you look at miseducation, the book Miseducation, if you look at the British working class, if you look at the work of Learning to Labor by Paul Ellis, they'll describe to you that working class children look for working class jobs. So I was never a conspiracy theorist. But when people spoke about the relationship between the economy and schooling, I dismissed it as a conspiracy theory. But then you have to ask yourself the question, why are so many young people of working class origin that are available to all these multinationals that pay a pittance for their labor? It's as a working class person who grew up in a working class environment, I found this to be really unacceptable. So I decided to study this and try to understand what's really happening in the education system. So the two things I pick up. The one is a colonization of education. We are learning from the wrong people. And Dr. or Professor Karori Singh from India was right. You need to look at education in the developing world and working class children in relation to their lived reality. What is their lived reality? And is that lived reality reflected in the curriculum? So when John Dewey spoke about education in the United States many moons ago, he said that education can provide social mobility. But his narrative has been disfigured in education. So education, I have found, is an environment where people want to make money. And people want to gain power from it through politics. So education, in my opinion, in the 21st century is more about personalities, power, and money. And it has disfigured the education narrative. So what we really need is systemic transformation in education in the developing world. And we need intellectuals in the developing world to produce knowledge that liberates their people. Now, you know what Frantz Fanon said about education in countries that have come out of colonization? That there's a new group of leaders, there's a new grouping of people who have no roadmap for the working class and for the oppressed, and they become like the colonizers. And I've seen this happen, and it's a very unfortunate state of affairs. So how does this relate to social emotional learning? And my presentation is called Social Emotional Learning, a Catalyst for Education Transformation in the Developing World. So I want to introduce my understanding of social emotional learning. So social emotional learning is a process of developing self-awareness, self-control, and interpersonal skills that are vital for school, work, and life success. People with strong social emotional skills are better able to cope with everyday challenges and benefit academically, professionally, and socially. From effective problem solving to self-discipline, from impulse control to emotion and management, and more. Social emotional learning provides a foundation for positive long-term effects on kids, adults, and communities. Children thrive, schools win, workplaces benefit, society strengthens, all due to social emotional learning. Now, if you look at the work of Paul Harris in Learning to Labor, he sketches the environment in Britain, working class white kids. He'll tell you, listen, he'll speak in a language that working class kids use. He'll describe what happens, and he'll tell you they look for working class jobs, and they don't value education. In any case, there are very few role models for children from the working class as far as education. The education hasn't worked for the parents, and these skills, social-emotional skills that I just mentioned, are not referred to in the work of Paul Harris. So I'm not too sure why they didn't extend that work, right? Or why he didn't extend that argument. So I looked at the working class kids in South Africa. I looked at the working class kids in Britain and the USA. And then I said, well, you can extend it, you can advance the debate of social emotional learning. And I think it's one very important intervention. So that's one issue that children in working class communities, right? So you get children that go into without these skills, there's working class townships. And many of them leaves part of the huge attrition in the developing world and the developed world, right? In the United States, there's go to prison, end up in prison, class kids. So there's also a deficit, and this is a big issue, right? There's a deficit, social and cultural. We did a lot of work in cultural capital. Explains the problem very clearly. So in the field of sociology, cultural capital comprises the social assets of a person: education, intellect, style of speech, style of dress, etc., that promote social mobility in a stratified society. From working class communities, in their communities, their parents are linked. So you need to radically transform. Distinct out from those communities. And so what I'd like to really explore is how colonization has made us who we are, and what in that colonization, but Franz Fanon gives a good answer to it, but I think it needs to be explored further. Why would people who produce knowledge in an education system in the United States or in the UK or in South Africa or other parts of the world, where there are big working class communities, many people come out of these communities, they enjoy social mobility, but they don't want to be associated with that environment and the upliftment of those kids. So this is a major impediment to academic progress, right? And how was colonization? I came to Morocco, and we did a research study in Morocco. And the same problem exists. Morocco is doing bad in the tests. Why? Because what Morocco does as well is it has a lot of colonial influence on education. So if you look at the statistics of children in reading and numeracy, I found it to be surprising that in a world that we have today, well, the world that we have today isn't surprising with what's happening with children in some parts of the world. I think education has lost its humanity. But we must not give up hope in this environment. Education has definitely lost its humanity. And what drives, so these recent political events that have emerged in the world at the moment confirms my belief that education is a commodity. And most of the decisions that are made economic or political. And that what we need to do in education is we need to transform this environment. For example, in the foundation phase in Morocco, to prevent the dropout, to prevent the low reading scores, the system has to adopt a social justice model that recognizes cultural capital and recognizes social capital. In the UK, they said that they have adopted the cultural capital principle. So I wrote to the education authorities in the UK and I asked them, how have you adopted the cultural capital principle? They sent me the curriculum, there's no evidence of any systemic transformation or transformation of the education system that reflects that they have adopted the cultural capital principle. So the elites control education all over the world. And those elites who have enjoyed some social mobility never want to be associated with their roots. So how do you transform in Morocco those reading scores? Is to address the issue of socio-emotional learning in the foundation phase. Give the children the skills. Socialize them into an environment. Allow or try to get the education system to attempt to provide or compensate for the lack of social and cultural capital in those schools. Why are those children dropping out in the rural areas? Why are they failing in reading in those international tests? Those international tests, in my opinion, are useless because it undermines the morale of the schools, the teachers, the education planners, because they don't have an understanding of why the children are failing. If they did have an understanding, you wouldn't have people writing a book like Bowles and Gintis did in 1976, Schooling in Capitalist America. What happens to the children? You wouldn't get a book like Miseducation, written by a professor at Cambridge, about what happened to working class children. In 2023 in the UK, when you had Education in the Working Class written by Marsden and Jackson in 1962 in the UK. So I asked the education authorities in the UK, why are they're not looking at these sociologists? Why are they not unpacking their debates to advance social mobility and a better quality education system for poor children? There was no response to that. to become victims of an economic system. We have to create an awareness, right? And I think this forum is a good forum, but we need to generate an alternative narrative. I've started that process, right? And I think that should be the goal of education in the 21st century. Reduce poverty, create the conditions for success for working class. The majority of children in the developing world were working class. I'll stop there, Chairperson. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naika. Well within your time. This will allow us as well for more time for the discussion. So I just want to remind all participants, please take note of Dr. Naika's presentation, and if you have any questions or comments, please post them in the chat. As well, we will give you an opportunity later to raise them directly if you are more comfortable speaking directly. Now, let me hand over directly to Professor Walsh. Over to you, Dr. Walsh.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. And thank you, Dr. Naika, for that wonderful presentation. I'm not sure I'm going to allay any of your fears, but I'll try and address the inclusive, like in terms of where we want to go to with sustainable development education in particular, this so-called importance of inclusiveness, care for others, and obviously care for planet as well. And the points are well taken that this starts at preschool in some ways, and people have to have a lifelong sort of vision of where they want to go. And it's clear that most education systems across the world are not doing that. I have potentially I have two presentations, but what I've decided to do is just to show you some of the work that we're doing in the SDG Academy and the sort of theories of change that, and hopefully it addresses some of the issues we just heard. So I'm on secondment to the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is basically an initiative of Secretary General's area with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, where academics try to mobilize SDG partnerships, Sustainable Development Goal partnerships at all levels of governance, meaning global, regional, national, and local levels, to implement the Sustainable Development Agenda, UN 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the Paris Agreement. So in my role I'm on secondment from University College Dublin, where I'm an economist. I have to hold up my hands. I'm working on the education portfolio, our division in SDSN. So most of you, I don't know whether you're following this, but there was a thing called Secretary General when he came in 2019, felt that the move towards sustainable development needs to be accelerated. And in what he called the Common Agenda, which was presented at the General Assembly in 2019, he had a pathway with a particular focus on particular issues to actually accelerate progress. So one was education, which was great because a lot of people felt that education was taking a back seat, and that transforming education in all its dimensions was just so important to be able to achieve any of the ambitions of the Sustainable Development Project. So we did have what's called a pre-test and then a test, a Transforming Education Summit at the General Assembly back in 2022. Other aspects that he wanted accelerated was youth engagement and peace and development and digital transformation and other things, all leading up to a summit called the Summit of the Future in September 24, where the idea is to reimagine the institutions, even of the UN, of the banks, of education systems, and so on, for the future we want. This semester, or this September, a few weeks ago, we had what's called the Midpoint Review, and the governments of Ireland and Qatar co-facilitated a political declaration. Most of us see this as a moment of hope because there's lots of reasons in the, let's call it in the Security Council, a lot of geopolitics, a lot of divisions in the world, where some members could have blocked this political declaration, but they didn't. So all 193 nations again reaffirmed their commitment to what they signed in 2015, which was the Sustainable Development Goals project, or Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. What I want to point out in that declaration is that it was quite important, obviously, that coming from the recommitting to the outcomes of the Transforming Education Summit, there is this paragraph in, it's a short enough political declaration, but it reaffirms its commitment to actually find money and to invest in education. And I just want to minimize this a bit. So this is the word inclusive. I know that's probably not enough for the previous speaker, but the idea is that we want inclusive and equitable quality education for all, basically. And we also, this is up to K-12 and preschool, also lifelong opportunities. And I'll come back to this again, lifelong learning opportunities for all. So it's starting with early childhood, or adult literacy programs, digital literacy, cultural education, education for sustainable development, digital technologies for education, skills enhancements, vocational training is emphasized, continuous professional development for teachers, and obviously gender education and so on. I'm just going to get a drink of water. And you'll see that the whole idea here is that to stimulate learning environments that enable all learners to achieve their full potential, physical, mental, and emotional, etc. And this is taking note of all the outcomes of the Transforming Education Summit, right? So there is this sense that in SDG Academy, we're secretariat to a thing called Mission 4.7, which is with Ban Ki-moon Center, the Center for Sustainable University with UNESCO and other partners. And what the call is here is what's called lifelong learning, right? So from preschool all the way up K-12, up to vocational and university, and even through your employment or lifelong, that there should be opportunities for people to engage in inclusive and good learning around inclusive and education and global citizenship. So that's easier said than done, but at least people are aware of the point that this has to start at very early years, and it has to be extremely inclusive, and it needs a complete transformation. Because I would agree that even in Ireland, in my country, yes, we came out of colonialism and we inherited a class system, but we certainly have an education system where you have free preschool, free primary, free secondary, free undergraduate, quite cheap postgraduate, and lots of lifelong learning opportunities. And we have a situation where 88% of girls would have participated in some form of third level education, which is extremely high, probably the highest in the world. But yes, I would argue that it is economically driven, in the sense it's STEM driven, and that people are asking for, look, we need care for people, care for planet, we need to have this openness for the digital transformation and sustainability transformations that are coming in. So we've got to go back to the early years, and we've got to infuse that in a lifelong learning. And people have to have a vision of that lifelong learning. They have to see their roles in society and how you can actually create a fairer world and a fair country and a community around them, and how it can be respectful and live in harmony with nature as well as with other people. So there's a huge amount of work to be done in transforming the curriculum and training the teachers and all the different things that we've been listening to in this conference, actually. So it is quite the challenge, but at least it's recognized, and at least it's in this political declaration, and every country is trying to work together to try and achieve this this sort of ambition. So where are we in the SDG Academy? Tradition, where we were set up was when the goals were signed in 2015, there was an acknowledgement, even in leaders or people in the UN system, that they were not really, their education didn't have embedded in it this sort of drive for inclusiveness and respect for equality and equity. It didn't have respect for nature and a real understanding of how we coexist with nature, with the air and the water and the land around us. So there needed to be some academic content or some, let's say, learning or knowledge content around the SDG. So we set up the Academy basically to create these courses or content so people could understand the science, the practice and policy issues behind each of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's essentially what we were doing for a while, is just developing these online courses, which you can find up on in different platforms. There is, I should know, there's one in Arabic, there's in Chinese, but in the English versions, this is up on edX on the MIT Harvard platform. So these are the courses that are available, and you can have a look at them. I think what was striking during COVID-19 is that the course on nature-based solutions was actually trending. So there's lots of different things that could be trending, but to have a sustainability course actually kind of out of the lead is a change, that there's a change in the mindset of people, both younger people and older people, who are starting to think about climate change and biodiversity and land use and ocean quality, etc. So this was produced with the UN Environmental Programme and SDG Academy. That's just one example. It's all very fine having content, but that content, what we're finding is, has to be mobilized into different uses. And what I mean by this is that, you know, we might want this to be used in universities, you know, in universities, for example, which is one I'm going to take. Universities train teachers, they train doctors, economists, accountants, lawyers, you know, so how do we actually get this content into these kind of undergrad and professional degrees? But also the same question can be asked of into getting into governments and the upskilling of workers in government, or now upskilling of workers in corporate enterprise who are facing ESG regulation, or how do we get it in? Or mobilize content into training and new forms of pedagogy. So just to give you an example, with my university, anyone, you don't have any background whatsoever, the SG Academy. So we use the Academy resource like an e-library or resources that go into the homeworks, etc. We do bring practice into the classroom because it's all online. And we bring policy, like people involved in policy, UN system, etc., into the classroom. So the classroom is a more science policy practice interface sort of feel to it. And at the end of the day, they do a capstone or a project where they implement their knowledge in their local environment. This could be in a community, it could be in a corporate, it could be in a government department, or it could be an academic piece. So this is an attempt to have something that's inclusive. It's inclusive because we have people from all over the world doing it. It's relatively cheap, it's high quality, and we also have created a pathway for people with no education can actually find a pathway into this master's, right? But this is one project, one example. I could give other examples of how we work with governments and corporates. So, for example, in Ireland, in the teachers, any teacher in Ireland, both primary and secondary, can take the cert. It will be paid for by the government, and if they want to, they can go on this pathway to a master's in sustainable development. Because a lot of teachers don't actually have a background in this kind of knowledge of society and environment and economy and governance and how they interact and how they interplay in their own local context. So that has to be something that they're interested in, right? Community, we have a few communities of practice, but the one that we're working a lot on at the moment is this open education resource recommendation of UNESCO. And this was a promise by governments in 2019. All governments of the world said they would provide free education resources to all levels of schooling, full stop, which they report on every 2 years. So this is called the UNESCO Open OER recommendation. In the run-up to TESS, the Transforming Education Summit, we've been working with kind of a partnership, libraries across the world, the libraries in the UN, working with academics, with edtech people, with private government people, just to see could we come up with a way of actually distributing content to every library in the world for free. And this is what this project is about. And it turns out we have the technologies to do this, actually, what's called the repositories, how you build on LMSs, how you can build on various content. And we have signed a legal agreement with UNESCO to do this, and we have funds and a partnership, and we're going to do this. Now, obviously, why we're doing this is that the content has to be done under fair and care and what's called FARS principles. And these are important, right? Because, you know, knowledge, it should be free to create knowledge. It should be free to access knowledge. It should be free to repurpose it, to translate it, to put it in your local context. And the beauty of the metadata and the way you can organize this in libraries is that people can take knowledge from anywhere and they can repurpose it to their own context and situation. And of course, this is sustainable development education, and it's all about how you would care for people and planet. And obviously, you might have a ambition for your own professions and what you want to do, but how do you exactly do this? So we actually think the global knowledge commons is not something that's there. It's something you need to create as a public good, and you need to put an awful lot of investment and energy into actually creating this content. But we're using the digital transformation in the public sphere as one potential instrument that can help people right across the world get content, create content, and repurpose it to their local context. And then finally, just we do what we call thought leadership. There's many, because of legislation in Europe, directives coming in, particularly around climate. There's a lot of
5 minutes more.
Yeah, there's a lot of sectors who are basically feeling that their workers are not really skilled to implement these sort of ideas. You know, managing emissions, for example, or implementing circular economy type ideas, recycling, and so on and so forth, right? So we felt the best way to tackle this is to look at vocational training, because this is where most of the professions, particularly in the construction industry, this is where people get certified and get their training and get their knowledge. So working with people with the vocational teachers and centers, working with the business and the academics, we're actually going through the curriculum and embedding some sort of digital and sustainable development learning that you would need, just putting in competencies relating to sustainability. So this is going to take a few years, but the idea, hopefully, is that this sort of template can be applied across many sectors where people basically are going back to vocational training, upskilling, getting their professional certification uprated, and then they can implement this in their particular industries, which just means we just have a better care for the environment, and hopefully we embed a lot of these inclusivity and social issues while we're doing it. Okay, so that was just a whistle tour just to give you some idea of where we're going or how we feel we can try and achieve this ambition that's in that statement of the political declaration. And obviously we're online and we're embedding ourselves in the digital transformation. But hopefully you'll get just some idea how we produce content, mobilize content into different use, how we're embracing ed tech, and how we're actually getting involved in legislative change and the kind of repurposing of accreditation across different sectors to orientate them more to sustainability and inclusiveness in their sectors and industries. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much to both Professor Walsh and Dr. Naika. Both of you were well within your time, so this gives us quite a bit of time for the discussion and question and answer. Before I open it to the participants, I just want to draw people's attention to some of the posts from Dr. Naika on additional information on the social justice framework and approach, as well as points he's made in addition to those from Professor Walsh on the construction of knowledge. And thanks also to Helen Perham for the links to the resources that Professor Walsh referred to, both from edX as well as the SDG Academy. And before I see there haven't been any questions posted on the chat, so I hope all participants that are still with us can raise their questions directly. You can just jump in or raise your hand. But before I do that, open it to the others, just to make a couple of comments from my side. Firstly, both the presentations really were very close to my heart. One from Dr. Naika, in that I'm originally from South Africa, and while I've been away for a very long time, I do know that the issue of colonization and so on is still very much the debate in South Africa and much of the lower income countries. However, and I'll come back to the question, how do we update some of those discussion, debates, and even the term working class in the current changing economic sort of environments that we have with the influence of technology and so on? Does the traditional definitions of working class still hold true? Perhaps you can think
public spend and you look at, like how much are, like, we can convince you that education is important. Nobody will ever push back and say, for peace, what's important? Education, right? In all its dimensions. For economic growth, education. For protecting the environment, education. So everyone will come back to education, but yet no one will fund it. And you have to try and, really lobby hard on ministers of finance and ministers of education that you've got to put more resources into education, right? And also to put it to them that, you're not really doing work for the Sustainable Development Project unless you're creating knowledge that's shareable. It should be open data, open education, open science, open data. And you should actually be putting work through your aid programs or through your partnerships at universities, and actually creating capacity in refugee camps or in Afghanistan or in your partner countries. Like, you are no good to this agenda if you're just focused on getting up university rankings or something like this, that you've got to be building capacities in LDCs and reaching out. And this is the essence. So it is great that those conversations are happening at those national or that kind of global level. But I do agree with you, though, is that how do you get it into local action in the community? But, a lot of us don't need government to tell us that it's helpful to have the resources, it's helpful to have the policies, but it's also important that communities of academics or communities of NGOs or different, that actually they take action anyway. Like, they don't need the policy or the fine. They can come up with their own innovative ways of actually doing this. And I would agree that the SDG Academy can create all the content and mobilize all the content at once and get it into the different stakeholders. But until we're reaching down into the poorest of the poor, we're failing. We're not winning here. So we have to think of mechanisms how to do that. And I'm putting my trust in technology and partnerships around technology.
Thanks, Professor Walsh. We can come back to this issue of, both technology as a facilitator and an opportunity, but also some of the downsides that we have to consider. But let's come back to that. Over to you, Dr. Naika.
Yeah, so the definition of working class. So, it's low pay, it's limited skill, it's physical labor, and or alternatively, cheap labor, and it has a major impact on performance of young people and the throughput rates of education systems. So nothing has changed much. In fact, I think, when you talk about working on the ground, I think people who have enjoyed social mobility should change the education narrative to call it out for what it is, right? And listen, with due respect to all the people involved in climate change and all that, listen, these big companies dominate the issues around climate change. We're not going to get what has changed in the last 10 years. In fact, the issues around climate has got worse, right? And I'm very skeptical about the United Nations. I'm very skeptical about all these global organizations, Are they really interested in humanity? Look what's going on in the world at the moment. Look what has happened all over the world. Currently, today, what's happening today in the world, right? Is there a commitment to humanity? That is why I think we need to change the narrative and make people aware. And that's the only way empowered people can change their lives. You're not going to get people who change their lives through listening to false narratives, socially constructed narratives that's got very little to do with reality. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I think before I come back to both of you for any comments, or even I may raise a couple of additional questions, I see that our overall, one of the chief organizers of the conference, Professor Benabot, has a question. So, Aaron, over to you. And then I still appeal to the other participants in the interim please do raise any questions or comments that you may have. Aaron?
Thanks very much, Jordan. So I have actually two kinds of comments that I think will end up as questions. The first is in relationship to lifelong learning opportunities. Just to give a little bit of background, like Jordan, I have a deep history in, I was director of the Global Education Monitoring Report and have been involved in the first reports that dealt with, SDG 4 and other education-related SDG targets, and helped to develop the team's kind of approach to the monitoring of some of these things. But the point that I wish to make is that although the goal speaks about lifelong learning opportunities, none of the targets do. And there's very little kind of real substantive recognition about what that means concretely. So in terms of a framework, we know it's from cradle to grave that includes early childhood through various kinds of non-formal adult educational opportunities, but there's very little information, systematic information, apart from very particular countries and particular regions of the world about the scale and scope and depth of the learning opportunities that people do have in their lives, even though it's much more prevalent than we typically are willing to acknowledge. And the evidence that we do have, let's say, that comes from the OECD PIAC framework, tends to show very clearly that those people that do take up the non-formal lifelong learning opportunities tend to come from those sectors that have higher levels of formal education. So in some sense, if Dr. Nacker talks about the kind of reproduction of the formal education, what we actually see in many ways through lifelong learning opportunities is a second form of reproduction that even exacerbates further, because formal education seems to beget non-formal educational opportunities. And so the kinds of disparities that have been shown to be related to formal education only get worse if you figure out who's actually taking up the various kinds of courses, including those that the SDSN is producing in the in the academy. So I think it's important to keep in mind that although it seems like it provides an open access, the people who actually make use of that tend to be the more educated classes, which is not. So there's a real challenge here, and I wonder how you're addressing that. And my other point is really with respect to the theme of the conference, and that is that although SDG 4 is the most holistic, comprehensive international policy agenda ever conceived, and certainly puts a focus on outcomes, in particular learning outcomes, the learning outcomes that essentially are prioritized in Target 4.1 have to do with very basic foundational skills, reading and writing. And the only places where social emotional learning potentially get integrated is in 4.7. But those are precisely the areas where any kind of systematic assessment or measurement instruments or whatever it may be are completely lacking. So even though 4.7 talks about knowledge and skills, and by the way, in the run-up to 4.7, skills were meant to be both hard skills and soft skills, and they deleted the term soft skills in the final formulation of 4.7. So there was an acknowledgement in the lead-up that it should include values and attitudes and other kinds of normative orientations, which are very much involved in social emotional learning, but in some ways get lost in the shuffle. Even though we know that to really bring about change with respect to sustainability and global citizenship and climate change education, social emotional learning is critical, right? But in the end, that's not where the money is going. The money of the international community and the bilateral donors has gone essentially to measure the foundational skills and maybe to some extent the employability skills. So if you think that money tells you where the priority of the international system is, it really is not around social emotional learning, which further, I think, emphasizes the point that Dr. Nacker made in his opening.
Thank you, Aaron. I think, as you said, both of them were more or less comments, but implicit questions as well. So I'll just leave it to both Dr. Nacker and Professor Walsh to respond to your question slash comment. You can comment on both or either one.
Can I try to comment
Sure.
on both? What I
Sure.
can see, they were very, very rich. That's very, very rich, Aaron, with the scripture. So hopefully I'll do this justice, right? So listen, I understand the idealism and realism kind of thing that's happening here, right? So just to say to Dr. Nacker, so I honestly, I think we should question our democracies and the control of corporate. I understand that. The whole education system, who's benefiting from the orientation of it, and who's benefiting from it. And even when you do kind of simple studies, like about, we had students doing work on human development, just looking at income of households, and then what they're getting, the social returns that they get at different levels of income. And it's always the richer seem to get the better schools and better hospitals and better access to everything and for free, right? While when you go down the line, it kind of actually gets more expensive and harder to access, and there's lots of reasons why they don't access, etc. So I'm fully aware, and the same very good points about, like the money that's put behind the monitoring education is there an economic return to education, right? Not looking at the social or environmental and other returns. So all of these things are quite correct. But at the same time, I think, let's call it the idealism or the dreaming is still important. And I do think this is why, when you were asking Jordan, yes, you get it done at the community level, and this is where it should start. But from my point of view, let's say there's an axis of concentrated lack of leadership, if you want to call it, that's in control at the moment, and you can attack that. Like, you can go to people who are running departments of education, who are in the Department of Finances, who are making education policy, allocating resources, and you can get, and this is what SDSN tries to do a lot, is try to say, no, right, this is what you should be doing, right? Like, in terms of creating access, in creating the continuum, in actually of doing evaluation, which is not purely economic, but it's also social and environmental and so on. And I agree, where's the data, where's the funding, where's the competencies, the training in the government departments? It all has to be built. But it's a real, to me, the transformation of education funding and the curriculum and the whole system is the key, which is noted, is the one transformation that is the enabler of all the other ambitious transformations that are in that agenda. So that's kind of my answer to that. So we have to go for system change, and we have to look at the decision nodes and the policies and how they can open up the different ways of doing education and the continuum and the monitoring and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Professor Walsh. I will come back to this question if we have time, about the issue of, what do we mean by system change, how and why? And then over to Dr. Nacker on Aaron's comment.
Yeah, so Professor Benavent, ask right? And to ask myself the question, I try, why isn't there significant advances? My gut feeling is that I don't believe that the bureaucracies is also a colonial concept, right? Its structure and the way it operates, and it's what Max Weber talks about, the iron cage, right? So that's self-explanatory, right? I don't think that the bureaucracy is an institution that can deliver on the SDGs, right? And I think you need a wider section of society to address these issues. Just the disciplinary knowledge, I mean, you spoke about 4.7, right? Just the disciplinary knowledge does not exist in many bureaucracies to translate the SDGs into action, particularly in the developing world, right? And so there's a lot of work for us to do. But, Jordan, sorry, I don't know what your title. I'm
That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. So just to let you know that South Africa is out of the Cricket World Cup. But anyway, I think I remain very confident that we can change the narrative about development, and we need to ask the question: what are the mechanisms that we need to deliver? So, I made the point about 1962 when Marsden and Jackson wrote about the British working class. And today is November 2023. And where are we? So this discussion and these forums help us to communicate and to talk about these issues. And I think that essentially we need to ask questions, fundamental questions, about why we have made so little progress. And I think the big question is, question what's going on in the world today. Where is our level of humanity? It's related to all those issues.
Thank you, Dr. Naika. Just a time check, Aaron and Sarah. Do we have time for more questions or discussion?
Yes, we have we have another 20 minutes before the session closes.
I don't see any questions from the participants. So I will go ahead and raise perhaps one or two more questions and maybe bring us back a little more closely to the conference themes and the issue of social and emotional learning. I think a lot of the discussions we've been having is really critical to the issue of transformation, the question of the role of education in the current context of the inhumanity of humanity in some senses, and a number of the broader macro questions. But to go down more at a micro level to what happens in the classroom, what happens in different learning spaces, I think one of the questions to raise, and I'm glad Professor Walsh that you posted that new declaration. Also, but I think heartening to note that there's an actual mention of physical, mental, and emotional well-being in that statement. And I think this is a far cry from what we've seen before. The recognition of the role of education beyond the economic imperatives. And so even though this may be a political statement at a very high level, I think it does send a message. So one of the things I've been looking at over the past 2 or 3 years, arising from some of the work I did in Afghanistan 3 years ago, is the changes in curricula globally. I remember when I left South Africa a long time ago, the whole outcomes-based education curricula debates and the failure of implementation of that policy. Over the last 5-6 years, almost all countries, both developed and developing alike, have introduced some form of competency-based curricula. And if you look at that, it's shrouded in very technocratic language, linking to critical thinking, being able to, perform at a high level, both in work, in life, and so on. But there have been questions about the breadth of curricula, the overload, and the role of teachers in this process. My question to both of you is, how do you see a realistic incorporation of attention to social and emotional learning in an approach to competency based that's very technocratic? Is there space for really having a much more responsive approach to curricular development that addresses the whole range of skills and knowledge that all children, all adults need? Many of these critical skills that are posed as essential are things that can actually and should be developed over a lifelong learning cycle and not to be inserted at different points alone. So the cumulative approach to social and emotional learning, as Dr. Knight has said, begins not just at early childhood, but I think at birth and even before. So what is your response to the way curricula are being developed from a competency-based approach at the moment? And linking to the conference theme of ensuring that social and emotional learning is addressed in a realistic manner.
So can I start?
Go ahead.
Sure.
Thank you. That's a good question, and I think most countries, particularly in the developing world, need to recognize that curriculum development is not a neutral process, and I think that's a fundamental challenge we face. So I wrote on the chat that we need to encourage critical thinking and open dialogue to challenge stereotypes and biases. And if you examine curriculum development, as I say, it's not neutral, but is it relevant? What is the lived reality of the majority of children who are struggling in the education system? And how does the construction of a pedagogy respond to that? So, when you talk about competency-based assessment, there's a bias in competency-based assessment. And, all these assessments I find extremely problematic, right? So what is the lived reality of children in working class communities? They don't have the social emotional skills. So, Professor Benavot just mentioned that, social emotional learning and all these other things in the SDGs is quite loose. And I think you mentioned, sorry, I'm going to call you for your first name, Jordan, that when you talk about social emotional learning, and how does it relate to, in some ways, to the construction of a pedagogy and a curriculum? There's nothing in education that's neutral. I've learned that. Because I looked and I tried to understand, why is it so difficult for children to succeed in the system? And this has happened for such a long time. And it's continuing, right? And so an exploration of a new idea, like social emotional learning, must be located within the specificities of context across the world. So it's relevant in the UK, it's relevant in the US, it's also relevant in virtually all the contexts in the world. So I was asked to speak at a Norwegian university, and they wanted me to speak about inclusive education in South Africa. But I spoke to the students for a week, and the biggest issue there in Norway was social emotional issues amongst adult students pursuing a degree. So I changed my topic. I didn't talk about inclusive education in South Africa. So it's about the issue of relevance. It is about the issue of relevance and the issue of transformation and changing the system. Education is a very conservative enterprise, I've realized. It is very difficult to change it. But that is why you need a conference like this And that is why you need to have this conversation, and that is why it can contribute to a different narrative.
Thank
That's
you.
all.
Thanks. Over to you, Professor Walsh.
Yeah. So great questions, Jordan. These are, must admit, these are the toughest questions I've ever got from a chair of a conference. So well done. Listen, the way, like, I've been teaching like for 30 years, and I've obviously been through school. And my first thoughts about all, like, yes, you know, when I'm grading, for example, I do rebel against, like, who am I grading for? You know what I mean? To give a score for an employer, or, you know, that's not my main ambition in the classroom in terms of outcomes. And I have to say that even from primary school or K-12 up or in university, you know, a lot of teachers do something quite different. Like, if you imagine, like, who gave you the right sort of insights into life or how to do something? Like, was it not when you were playing sport or chess or music, or, you know, like, it was nothing to do with the curriculum. It was nothing to do with those exams to get to the next step. It was, you got these life learnings and supports, you know, social and emotional supports from your community, and the teacher was one of the key players of this, right? And it's the same in a university. When people don't have experience of doing PhDs or going on to different parts, a lot of what lecturers do and professors do is to take people aside and say, look, this is how you do it, this is what you should be watching out for, etc. Right? So I do think in the current system there can be social and emotional supports, you know, in the system, but they're certainly not part of the curriculum, and they're not part of the evaluation and so on, right? And they should be there more, obviously, right? So just to tell you about an exercise in Europe, so in Europe, in the European Commission, or the Director for Education, all European countries have their own way of setting curriculum. There's no directives coming from the center because it's heterogeneous. It's the most heterogeneous thing in Europe is education systems and curriculums, and what you learn and how you learn, etc. Right? But all of them were asked a very simple question. Well, how are you bringing in sustainability or greening or whatever you want to call it into your curriculum and into your, you know, from preschool up, and how you want to do it? And it is interesting how they workshopped it by bringing in partnerships and what I call the outside school. So they've kind of brought in community members, they brought in horticulturists, you know, people to say, well, maybe this is what you should be learning, how to care for the environment, how to care for society, maybe. And then they're thinking about, how does that change? Could that be evaluated? You know, so, you know, at the end of the day, the people, they have curriculum by committee, curriculum by how examinable it is, how you can grade it. You know, this is the competencies. So in the end, I think these people are looking at, okay, so empathy, like, so how do we measure how much love people have for each other? Like, how are we going to teach that, and how are we going to measure it? You know, and this is the complexity of what starts to happen. But I think the good news, though, is that they are realizing that this sort of emotional well-being, etc., and the local context and the culture, all the issues that were brought out in this session, that there are ways, you know, to bring it into the classroom and into the pedagogy, etc., and into using the outside school in a kind of structured way. But I have to say, though, at the end of the day, the system is dominating in terms of its need to have a curriculum, have something measurable, have something they can grade. And again, you know, we all have to ask, where does the money go, and what do people, who's driving the school process, and so on and so forth. So all these questions are very good. But I do think that I don't think it's new. I think these things are in every level of schooling and through the teachers, but I think it's a different question to say, can you bring them into the formal kind of curriculum and not have it ad hoc, where one kid gets the benefit of access to a teacher when it should be everyone. Everyone should have that knowledge and that support. You know what I mean? So how do you do that? You know, so it's a very challenging question you asked, to be honest.
Thank you very much, Professor Walsh. And I think I agree with your statement. Is in this move towards these competence-based curricula, we do have to attempt to widen the access to all forms of learning and skill development. There's one question from one of participants, Mr. Naji, which in a way I think has been answered somewhat on the question of, the international influence and the funding that drives policy in low-income countries, the reliance on what can be done, and he speaks of this vicious circle. And I think from the discussion already, it would appear that, very often the norm, the status quo reproduces. So I'm not going, in the interest of time, we can close, but just to thank you again, and also to recognize that this discussion has been very useful, and that, we have one more session, and I'm sure it will contribute as well in Aaron's last session that he's moderating, and some of the conclusions. To end on a positive note, we all talk about transformation and the need for radical change, but I'm reminded often of Tayak and Tobin's work of almost 20 years ago called Tinkering Towards Utopia. And in a way, it seems that's what we do in education. Is it really possible to transform completely? So in a way, I thought about it when the TAS was being launched, and I said, here we go again. It's fool's paradise. So let me stop there and hand over back to Aaron and Sarah.
Thanks very much, Jordan. Thanks very much to Professor Walsh and Professor Naker. We are going to take a 5-minute break, and then we will begin the last session of the conference that will begin in 5 minutes. So please stay tuned, and we'll be right back.